think we're going to get started now. Dr. Shana Strauch, Schick, I apologize, is a fellow of the Center for Israel Studies at Yeshiva University and teaches Talmud and halakhah in Michelet Mevaseret Yerushalayim and Matan in Israel and in the Drisha Summer Kollel. In 2011, she became the first woman to be awarded a PhD in Talmudic literature from Bernard Revel Graduate School at Yeshiva University, where she also completed an MA in Bible. She studied in the graduate program in advanced Talmud at Stern College and has held postdoctoral fellowships at Bar Ilan and Haifa University. Her upcoming book, Between Thought and Deed, Intention in Talmudic Jewish Jurisprudence, examines the role of intentionality in the development of Talmudic law and is being published by Brill. And now, without further ado, Dr. Schick.
Thank you so much. And welcome everyone who I can't see, but I can feel the presence. It's very exciting to be here, to be able to learn Torah with people all over the world. I'm here in Jerusalem, and it's nighttime here, but good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast, and good evening to my fellow Israelis. So this is a three-part series, which is going to explore different aspects of intentionality with regard to the holidays of Tishrei. Today we're going to focus on Rosh Hashana. We'll talk about Yom Kippur the next time, and the last time we'll go to Sukkot. And all of them, we're going to see how and whether intentionality plays a role in each of these mitzvot. Okay, so tonight we're going to focus on Rosh Hashana, and specifically the mitzvah of hearing the shofar. And so when we look to early rabbinic law in the Mishnah and the Tosefta, we find that ritual mitzvot, which involve doing kind of ritual acts, such as blowing the shofar, are very much closely tied to a person's eternal devotion. And indeed, when we look at the Mishnah, we find that when it does talk about whether a person needs Kavannah and intentionality to fulfill a mitzvah, we find that it always rules that one must have a requisite attention in order to fulfill their mitzvah, in order to fulfill their obligation. So in our first source, and I'm going to share the screen. Some of them are English, some are, I have it in English, but you have it in Hebrew as well. So in the first source you have, which is Masechet Brachot, and it's about the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, our daily obligation to recite Shema and accept, the yoke of heaven upon us. So it says in the Mishnah there, Bet Aleph in the Brachot, Hayakorei Batorah. The person's reading through the Torah, and they happen to read the portion of the Torah which contains the pasuk of Shema Yisrael, V'higia Zman HaMikra. And at the same time that you're reading the portion of the Torah of Shema, it happens to also be the time that you have to say Shema. It's Shema Kriyat Shema. Im kivein libo yatsa. If you direct your heart, you fulfill your obligation. If you do not direct your heart, you do not fulfill your obligation. So by direct heart in the ancient world is the seat of the intellect. So what that means is, if you have a kavanah, if you intend, then you fulfill your mitzvah, your obligation of saying Shema. But if you did not intend, then you did not fulfill your mitzvah. And we find the same halakhah is corroborated in the Tosefta, another Tanaitic work in the same time of the Mishnah. So that's our first mitzvah we find in the Mishnah on this matter. When we skip to Masechet Rosh Hashana, we find something very similar. So it's the next source, number 2. Misha over acharei beit hakneset. One, here you have the English, one who was passing behind a synagogue. So you're walking past the shul, or you happen to live right near the shul. Your house is next to shul. V'shama kol shofar. And you're walking past the shul on Rosh Hashana, and you hear them blowing the shofar inside. O kol Megillah, or you hear them reading the scroll of Esther, And that's on a perm. So you happen to be walking past a shul and you happen to hear the shofar being blown at the time that you have to hear it being blown. And again, the Mishnah rules the same way we saw before. In kivein libo yatsa, vimlav lo yatsa. If you direct your heart, I mean, if you have in attention, you fulfill your obligation. But if not, if you do not have in attention, you do not fulfill your obligation. And now it says, makes it clear that this is not just about doing an act. It's about having your mindset in line with the act. Even though this person heard and this person heard, two people do the same exact act of hearing the shofar being blown, but nevertheless, only one of these two people fulfill the mitzvah. Why? One person directed his heart, and one did not direct his heart. And only the one who directs their heart, that person will be the one who fulfills their obligation to hear the shofar. And one more time, this is reiterated in Masechet Megillah, the tractate dealing with the holiday of Purim. Hayakotva, if you are writing the scroll of Esther while reading it, or you are a dorsha, you're reading and expanding it, makia, or you're reading and checking for mistakes, dotting the I's and crossing the T's in Hebrew, of course. Again, even though you are reading the Megillah at the time that it has to be read, you will only fulfill the mitzvah, you only fulfill your obligation if you directed your heart. So it's very clear from these three cases that the Mishnah talks about that one can only fulfill their obligation if they also have a kavanah. They have some sort of mental intentionality, it seems, to do the mitzvah. Now, it doesn't define what the kavanah is. What does it mean to direct your heart? So the next source I brought for you, source number 4, which is the Mishnah that comes right after source number 2. Meaning, first the Mishnah says, if you're walking past a shul and you hear the shofar, if you intend your heart, you fulfill the mitzvah. If not, you do not fulfill it. The very next Mishnah, which comes after that, is source number 4, which seems like a kind of unrelated midrashic narrative. The Mishnah there says, it brings up the pasuk from Shemot, and it was when Moses lifted his hands, and then the Israelites were stronger than the Amalekim. So when Moshe held his hands, Israel was winning, and when he lowered his hands, Israel was being defeated. So ask the Mishnah, do the hands of Moshe make war or break war? This pasuk is coming to tell us that it wasn't about Moshe's hands. It's not the act he did. Rather, as long as Israel looked heavenward and mishabdim at libam, they subjugated their heart to their Father in heaven. They were victorious. If not, they fell. And it brings the same idea with regard to the copper snake Moshe made in the wilderness when the Israelites were suffering from a plague. And again, it says, is looking at serpents going to heal you or not? And again, it says, well, when you look heavenward and you again mishabed at libam, you subjugate your heart to God, then that's what will heal. But if not, it won't work. So what is this Mishnah coming to say? Yes, it's a midrash, looks like it has nothing to do with it, but rather it's very much related. It's not enough to do an act of hearing the shofar, of having Moshe raise his arms. It has to be accompanied by a subjugation of the heart. And notice the word mishabdim et libam, leiv. That same word, leiv, appears in both Mishnah Hazayin, source number 2, and source number 4, Mishnah Chet. Now that's not a coincidence. For in other occurrences of this very same midrash, it lacks the word leiv in it. So it looks very much like the compilers of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, purposely put that word levin to make a connection, to say, what does it mean to have kavanah of the lev when you are doing a mitzvah? Perhaps it means to subjugate your heart to God, to say, I am doing this mitzvah because it's what God wants of me, because that is my way of being an Eved Hashem, a servant to God. So this is just the overwhelming feel. Yes.
We have a couple questions in the chat relevant to what you just said, so I just want to raise them for you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
So I have two. One from Robert Cohen says, in the case of Megillat Esther, isn't the mitzvah to hear the Megillah rather than to read it? And then the other question is from Shira Hofer, and she was wondering that the examples you gave were from people coming upon the action by accident or surprise. And what about someone who intends to do a mitzvah, but they don't really mean it or feel it? Like someone who does shofar halakhically but doesn't mourn, for example.
Okay, those are both excellent questions. So I'll answer the second one first. We're going to see, I mean, yeah, we are going to see that. But yeah, I don't know. Now, it's possible to read the source of Mishnah number 4, not as a way to define the kavanah in Mishnah number 2, but rather maybe it's more lifnim mishurat hadin. Halakhically, you just have to intend to do the mitzvah. But if you want to go over and above, mishabdim et libam la'afiyah shabbat shamayim, you have to also subjugate your heart. But that's not what you have to do to fulfill the mitzvah. Now, a support for that would be, this is a larger issue of what is the role of Midrash? Is it coming to teach halakhah, or is it come to tell you other ways to do the halakhah? I mean, it's not that this is the way you have to do the halakhah, but it's an alternate. It's more of like going above what the halakhah wants of you. Al-pi halakhah, in the kivei libo yatsa, you just have to know you're doing a mitzvah. I mean, it's not enough just walk past a shul and be like, oh, there's a shofar, that's nice. No, I have to want to do the mitzvah. But maybe above and over that is, you have to also say, I'm accepting God as my king, you know, etc. So it's possible that you don't need both. And we're going to see when we look to the Talmud, you absolutely do not need even a minimal amount of kavanah, but we're going to get to that soon. In terms of the first question, so that is a very big issue. What's the mitzvah of Megillah? But what do we say? L'kra, you know, amikra to Megillah. And do women have a mitzvah just to hear or to read? That's a machloket between the aharonim. And so therefore, but the mitzvah is definitely to read the Megillah. And maybe some say maybe women only have an obligation to hear it. And therefore, according to that view, if a woman was the one reading the Megillah, she couldn't fulfill the obligation for a man, because a man has an obligation to read it. But it's a machloket whether women's obligation is to hear it or to read it. So according to those who say women could read it, then women could fulfill the obligation for men. So the mitzvah is to read it. Those are both excellent questions. Okay, so that's the Mishnah. And there's just one more Shneic source I want to bring, which is not in the sources, but it's just kind of like it. So, and it really relates, it just kind of drives home the point of how much of a role a kavanah plays in the Mishnah. So Mishnah, and also in Brachot, Parakeh, Mishnah Aleph 5:1, it says, so one should only stand up to pray, meaning Shmona Esrei, with a serious frame of mind, Sefaria translated, you know, like heavy head. Then it talks about Hasidim HaRishonim, the original pious ones, they would wait a whole hour and then pray, so they could get their hearts ready, so they could direct their hearts to a God. Now, interestingly, in the Bavli, it's like, well, you pray 3 times a day, and if they prepare an hour each time, when do they work? So that is a question, and maybe you're wondering that too. The rabbis also did, and this is certainly not normative behavior. This is the Hasidim. It's not Hasidim with a shtreimel on their head. This just refers to people who are very pious, a group of people. I'm not sure who they were, but but just underscores the point of the great role that kavanat halev, the attention of the heart, plays in the Mishnah. And I think that kind of makes sense when you think about doing mitzvot rituals. I think most of us would tend to agree that makes sense that if you're a religious person, it's not just the act. You should have some sort of an eternal devotion as well. I would think maybe that's what we would originally think. However, when we look at the Bavli on this sugya, we find a very surprising shift. We find something very different. Okay, so I have the English here, but I'll read the Hebrew in your source sheet. Source number 5. So they sent the following ruling to the father of Shmuel. Shmuel, of course, is the great first generation Babylonian rabbi, and his father is actually one of like the earliest rabbis we are aware of living in Babel. So this is what they sent to his father. Kafu b'achal matzah. If a person is compelled to eat matzah on the holiday of Pesach, yatzah, you fulfill your obligation. Okay, so you didn't want to eat it, someone put it in your mouth. Basically, that seems to be what the case is. So even though you didn't want to, you were made to do it, it seems, you fulfill your mitzvah on Pesach. Rava, a fourth generation Babylonian Mora, and one of the most influential rabbis of the Bavli, infers the following. Amar Rava, Zot Omeret Hatokea Lashir Yatsa. This would imply that one who blew the shofar on Rosh Hashana to make music, meaning, and not to fulfill their obligation, but they love the sound of the shofar. It's like a jazz song. They fulfill their religious obligation on Rosh Hashana. Now that is a striking rule, because it explicitly goes against what is said in the Mishnah. But that's not what the Gemara says at first. It will get to that, but first it says, well, peshita, hainuhach, that's obvious. If you can fulfill your mitzvah of matzah when being forced to, you can, of course, you can fulfill the mitzvah of shofar even if you didn't want to. So answers the Gemara, no, it's not an obvious analogy. Ma'odetema, what might you have thought? Hatam achol matzah, amar rachman v'ha'achal. Maybe in the case of eating, when you eat, that is what the mitzvah is. So as long as you're eating it, you've done your mitzvah, whether you wanted to or not. The very fact that you're eating it, your body's getting nourishment, you are just completely engaged in the act of eating matzah. But maybe halakhah, but here in the case of shofar, it says in the Torah, zichron teruah kitiv. It says, it's a remembrance of hearing the shofar. So if you just hear it playing music, you're not doing it for the purpose of zichron teruah. So maybe you would have thought matzah is not like shofar, so kamash malan it is. And then concludes that the Gemara, alma kisava Rava, so consequently this shows that Rava holds Mitzvot Zerikhot Kavannah, that religious precepts do not require attention. Now, this is a striking rule, primarily because it goes against what we saw in the Mishnah. Now, of course, we only saw 4 cases in the Mishnah. We saw Kriyat Shema, Shofar, Megillah, Tefillah. Now, the fact that the Mishnah didn't formulate a general rule is not surprising, because that's just not the way the Mishnah generally writes. The Mishnah speaks in cases. So it brought in only individual cases. So it would seem that it likely held that all mitzvot require attention, but we don't know that for sure. But at least what we do know is that what does require attention hearing the shofar. And what does Rava say? If you blew the shofar for music, you fulfill your obligation. And from there, the Gemara, the anonymous redactors of the Gemara infer Mitzvot Zerikhot Kavannah. So this goes against the Mishnah, and indeed, that's exactly what the Gemara now raises against Rava. The fact that he explicitly contradicts the three Mishnayot that we saw, and it'll bring other ones as well. So the first challenge it brings from Masechet Brachot, the first Mishnah we saw. Eitvei, so he challenged Rava. Hayad Koreh Batorah, if one's reading the Torah, V'giz Man HaMikra, and the time of reading the Shema benediction arrives, Lo Yatsa. So it says straight out, you only fulfill your obligation of Shema if you had a kavanah. So Rava, how could you say you don't need a kavanah to blow the shofar and then therefore Mitzvot Zerikhot Kavannah? Says the Gemara, no, you got it wrong. You thought my love kivein libo latzei. Do you think does this not mean you had an attention to fulfill the mitzvah? No, you were wrong. What's the kavanah you need? Likrot. You just need the intent to read the pasuk of Shema. Wait a minute, likrot. Hakakari, he was reading in the Mishnah. That's exactly what the case is. If one is reading the Torah, and the time of reading arrives, you only fulfill the mitzvah if you had in attention. Says the Gemara, no, again, you misunderstood. How was the person reading in this Mishnah? It was Bikore lehageh. This person was reading, what's that? Reading to correct. But you weren't actually reading it for the sake of reading. If you were just kind of making sure all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed, then you weren't reading it. You have to have a minimal intent to do the act of reading. More than that, would say Rava, you don't need. Okay, now it brings another challenge. Our next Mishnah that we saw, Mishnah 3:7. If one was passing behind a synagogue, or whose house was near a synagogue, if he intended his heart, he fulfills the mitzvah, his obligation. If not, he has not fulfilled his obligation. So again, the Mishnah says straight out, you only fulfill the mitzvah of shofar if you had a kavanah. And again, says the Gemara, my love, in kivein libo latzeit, doesn't this mean you had intent to fulfill the mitzvah? So again, the Gemara says, no, that's not what if he directs his heart means here. All it means is lishmoa. You just have to direct your heart to hear it. You have to intend to hear it. Lishmoa v'hashama. What do you mean he has to have to intend to hear it? He does hear it. That's the case. You hear the sound of the shofar. Says Gemara, no. In this case, the person didn't know he was hearing a shofar. Savar chamor ba'almahu. He thought it was the sound of a donkey braying. It sounded like hee-haw, so he thought it was a donkey. So in order to fulfill the mitzvah of shofar, you don't have to have an intent to do the mitzvah. You have to just have a bare minimum intent to know that you're doing the act of hearing the shofar. Now it brings another objection, because maybe you could say, well, Rava's case is a person who blows a shofar. So maybe if you blow it, that's different than hearing it. But the Gemara anticipates that and brings another Mishnah. And they bring one more objection. Eitzveh, nitzkavein shomea below nitzkavein mashmi. So it says in the Mishnah, if the one who listens intends, but the one who sounds the shofar does not intend, or vice versa, or mashmiya below nitzkavein shomea, or the one who sounds the shofar intends, the one who listens does not intend, lo yatsa. Neither of them fulfill their obligation. Now, so it makes a sense. You can have a case where the person who hears does not intend to hear a shofar, but the one who does blow does have it in attention. But But how can you have a case where the person who blows the shofar doesn't have the intent to blow the shofar? I mean, how is that possible? If we're saying that intent just means intent to do the act, then how do you ever have this case of the one who sounds the shofar does not intend? How can you have such a case? It's not possible if it's just about blowing the shofar. He obviously knows he's blowing the shofar. And yet we can have a case where he does not have intent and they're not yotzei the mitzvah. So says the Gemara, no, we can find a case where the one blowing does not have the bare minimum amount of intent. How? It's where Dilma de Kamenabach Nebuche. He's making like a barking sound. So he's not trying to blow the shofar. He's just like making a barking sound with the shofar. So if that's what the person blowing the shofar is doing, then that doesn't count. So throughout this Gemara, it defends Rava's position, showing that even in Mishnayot, which seem very straightforwardly to require requisite and attention when doing a mitzvah, the Gemara here downplays that in attention as not intention to do a mitzvah, but rather as intent to just do an act which constitutes a mitzvah. And the Gemara brings more challenges to Rava. And now it brings a final one in the name of Rava's contemporary Abaye. So Abaye asks, well, wait a minute. According to you, Rava, if you don't need attention to do a mitzvah, then if someone sleeps in a sukkah, when there's no longer a mitzvah to sleep in the sukkah, you should automatically violate the prohibition against adding onto mitzvot, because you don't need a kavanah to do the mitzvah. So by doing an act which constitutes a mitzvah and that you know you're doing, you should automatically violate the asur of lo tosif, that you're not allowed to add to mitzvot. And by sleeping in the sukkah on the 8th day, you add on to that, even if that wasn't your in a tent. So that's a challenge raised against Rava. And then the Gemara maintains Rava by applying a new rule. And its answer is Rava, no, you misunderstand Abaye. When we say you don't need kavanah, that's to fulfill a mitzvah. But you do need kavanah to violate an isur. So says Rava Amar, let's say lo bai kavanah. Not so, says Rava, for I maintain that mitzvot, commandments can only be, I skipped a point here. So first he says, I skipped one line. He says, let's say lo bai kavanah, to fulfill does not require in attention. Lavor bai kavanah, but to violate does require in attention. Then Rava says another rule, ela mar Rava, let's say bai kavanah. To fulfill a mitzvah requires kavanah. Lavor bismano lo bai kavanah, shlo bismano bai kavanah, and to violate prohibition in its own time does not require in attention. To violate not in its own time does require in attention. Finally, it goes to the final rule of Rava, which is right here. Rava says finally, let's say lo bai kavanah. Commandments can only be transgressed or answer them in their proper times. Intention is not required to fulfill one's religious duty. The intention is required to transgress by adding to commandments. So basically, Rava makes a distinction between doing a mitzvah, which he does not require kavanah. You don't need an attention to fulfill a mitzvah in order to fulfill the mitzvah. But in order to violate a prohibition, you do need a kavanah. And Mishnayot, which seem to say outright that you do require a kavanah, Rava says, no, that just meant a bare minimal kavanah to do the act which constitutes a mitzvah. Now, the end of the sugya might imply that we go back to the Mishnah, because it brings an earlier rule by a rabbi who came before Rava, where it says the final two lines, Amar le Rebbe Zera le Shammai. Rebbe Zera said to his servant, Yichavein v'takali, have kavannah, have intent, and blow the shofar for me. Alma kesavar mashmiya by kavannah. Consequently, he holds that the person blowing the shofar must have intent. And that's how the sugya ends. So while that might seem like it calls Rava's rule into a question, the overwhelming feel of this sugya, of this passage, is that mitzvot do not require attention, and not just the mitzvah of shofar, but also clearly the mitzvah of Shema, mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah, and the fact that it raises challenges against Rava's rule from various mitzvot and not just shofar, which seemed to imply that he didn't limit this rule to shofar, and indeed he learned it out from the mitzvah of matzah. So it's clear from this sugya that not only does Rava hold mitzvot do not require intent to fulfill one's obligation, but that's the overwhelming feel of this sugya. And when we look to other sugyot, we see that Rava's rule is a given dominance. So for example, that's in the order, totally unrelated Mishnah. Relates to Daf Yomi from Masechet Eruvin. Says Masechet Eruvin, Hamotzi tefillin, if someone finds a pair of tefillin, of phylacteries on a Shabbos, in a place where you're not allowed to carry, now what do? As we all know, they cost a lot of money, and you don't want to leave them out in a public domain. So how do you save not only this expensive, but this holy object? You can't just leave it out. So machisim zug zug. So what you do is you wear it pair by pair. One hair, one arm, you bring it. Go back out, put in another head set, another arm set. So you take it one set at a time. Rabban Gamliel mer shnayim shnayim. Rabban Gamliel says you can take out two pairs at a time. You can do two headsets and two arm ones. That's what you do. So this is a dispute about a very specific set of halachot tefillin and what you're allowed to carry on a Shabbos. And when we look at the beginning of the Bavli sugya on this Mishnah, which is not here, but you have in the sources, source number 7, we see that the original understanding of these two views is wholly about laws of Shabbos and tefillin. So first it says Ma'ika Savar. So what is behind these two opinions? What do they hold here? Iksavar Shabbos man tefillin. If you hold that Shabbos is a time to wear tefillin, you take one pair. And then it says, well, maybe it's a machloket about how many places on the head are there to wear tefillin. And it says, well, maybe it's about how can you save articles on Shabbos? Can you only save them in the way you normally wear them during the week? So meaning this machloket is understood within the confines of the laws of Shabbat and tefillin. Then in the second half of the Talmudic passage, it suddenly introduces a new factor. Then it says, well, if you want, you could say, Kule Alma Shabbos Zaman Tefillin. Maybe everyone actually thinks that you can wear tefillin on Shabbos. There is a mitzvah to wear tefillin on Shabbos. And what's the dispute about in this Mishnah? Why does the first opinion of the Mishnah say you only bring one pair of tefillin, and Rabban Gamliel say you can wear two pairs of tefillin? The machlokes about Mitzvot Zerikhot Kavannah kimipalgi. They argue about whether mitzvot require attention. So one holds mitzvot do require kavanah, and therefore he holds you can wear two sets of tefillin, because As long as you don't have Kavannah to do the mitzvah, it's like you're wearing an ornament on your head and your arm, but you're not doing the mitzvah. Whereas the one who holds you can only wear one pair of tefillin holds that mitzvah do not require Kavannah. But then the Gemara goes on. And if you want, I can say, Kule Amalot say lo by Kavannah. Everyone actually agrees with Rava that mitzvot do not require a Kavannah. Everyone agrees you don't need Kavannah to do a mitzvah. And what's their dispute about in the Mishnah? Whether you can violate not adding to mitzvot with Kavannah. Something that we saw in the sugya in Rosh Hashana. And then it says, if you want, you can say everyone agrees that mitzvah do not require a Kavannah, and everyone agrees that you don't need a Kavannah to violate not adding to mitzvah when it is the right time, or their dispute is when it is the right time, when it's not the right time. So what do we see from here? Why did I bring this? To show you that not only did our sugya in Rosh Hashana go overwhelmingly like Rava against the Mishnah in saying that mitzvot do not require a kavanah. But even when we find a totally unrelated halachot, the Gemara assumes that everyone agrees mitzvot don't require a kavanah, that mitzvot do not require requisite intent, such that it was understood as the source of a totally unrelated halakhah about tefillin and Shabbos. So that is how much weight is given to this rule of Mitzvot lo Zerikhot Kavannah. Now, we're going to see, not so much time left, that even though the Gemara is quite clear on its view, the later medieval rabbis went back on this, what seems very clear and makes this a matter of a debate again. But before we go to the medieval times, I want to spend a little more time in the Bavli, because we see, so Rava's rule of Mitzvot lo Zerikhot Kavannah, it contradicts the clear view of the Mishnah. I mean, the clear, at first, a glance read of the Mishnah. Yes, the Gemara managed to fit Rava's view into it, saying, well, when it said direct your heart, I didn't mean to do the mitzvah, I just meant to do the minimum act of hearing the shofar, the minimum act of reading the pasuk which has Shema, the minimal act of reading the Megillah. But it does seem that Rava's view is very radical and that it goes against the view of the Mishnah. But I want to show you next that not only does it go against the view of the Mishnah, it also goes against Rava's overwhelming tendency with regard to other areas of halakhah. For although Rava disregards the need for a kavanah when it comes to fulfilling a mitzvah, Rava is actually very consistent in always acquiring a kavanah to commit a violation, to be over an avera, and often he introduces a need for intentional behavior when committing an avera, where others did not be for him. So just to bring you a few examples of Rava's position with regard to committing a sin. With regard to idolatry, for example, there's a machloket re-accorded, debate re-accorded between Abai and Rava. If someone worships idolatry out of love and fear, meaning they love a person or they love the form of idol worship, not clear what that means. Abai Amar Chayev, Abai says this person's liable. Rava Amar Apater, Rava says he's absolved. Now why? Abai Amar Chayev Dehal Pacha. Abai says he's liable because he worshipped idols. I don't care why you did it. What does Rava say? Rava Amar Pater, I kiblua aleh melah, in ilo lo. You're only liable if you intend to accept this idol as a god. And if not, you're absolved. It's not the act that matters when you do sin. It's what you think, what you believe. And we find similar debate between Abai and Rava when it comes to the obligation of martyrdom. Abaye and Rava debate how Hester, the biblical heroine of Megillat Esther, could have married a non-Jew, Achashverosh, even under duress, and not choose the path of martyrdom as mandated by rabbinic law. So Abaye says, so why was she not required to give up her life? Abaye Amar Esther Karka Olam. She was the ground of the earth. I mean, she was a passive object in this act. I mean, she wasn't active. She let the act be done to her. Rab Amar Hanat Atzman Shani. When the non-Jew wants it for their own benefit, it is different. Because if you don't say this, how do we give fires to the Zoroastrian temples, which apparently Jews did during Rava's time? Rather, since they're in a tent, it's for their personal benefit, it's a difference. So here too with Esther, Ahasuerus didn't care about having Esther violate her religion. It was for his own pleasure, and that's why Esther was not obligated to give up her life. So for Rava, it's the intent of the coercer, which is the primary factor in defining the violation and the appropriate response by the Jew being compelled. And then he brings another case. If a non-Jew wants you to break Shabbos, you can or cannot, according to Rava, depending on why the non-Jew wants you to. So if it's to feed an animal, a non-Jew wants you to cut grass to feed an animal, that's fine, because he just wants you to feed his animal. He doesn't care about you breaking halakhah. But if he tells you cut the alfalfa and throw it into the river, let the Jew allow himself to be killed. What's the reason? He wants to make him violate his religion. So we don't just care about the act. We care about why is this act being done. What's the purpose? What was the intent of either the violator or the person making you do the violation? And Rava also maintains a consistent requirement of intentional action throughout the laws of damages as well. I have many examples, but I'll just bring you one. So in the laws of a person watching over another person's property, if the property was damaged, how does a custodian absolve himself? Through an oath. So Rava says, Shavua shelo b'kavanah shevar atiyah. I take an oath that I did not break it b'kavanah, intentionally. As long as you didn't break it with a kavanah, you're fine. You can absolve yourself with merely taking an oath. So in sum, we find that in a wide range of cases, Rava requires a kavanah, in intent, to render a person liable. And so therefore, this makes it all the more surprising that Rava de-emphasizes the role of a kavanah in mitzvot. And as we saw, the overriding direction of the Bavli goes with Rava as well. Now, Rava himself made the distinction that to fulfill does not require an intent. But to commit a wrong does require an intent. So even though, as I said, one might think it's a more natural thing to require an intent in the performance of mitzvot, as the Mishnah seems to mandate, there's actually a real rationale for Rava's view. Because what we see from Rava, that there is a clear break for him between violations and mitzvot and ritual practices, because these really are all rituals that we refer to. Ritual of hearing the shofar, the ritual of reciting the Shema, the ritual of reading Megillah. I would argue that Rava's principle and approach to ritual and anticipates a perspective that actually contemporary ritual theorists describe about the significance of ritual. That ritual is not really about what people think. And it doesn't need to be tied to a person's internal devotion. But rather, what makes ritual meaningful is that it's an act shared by a particular group of people, a particular culture, who gives it a particular meaning at a time. Meaning, yeah, I can light candles, but what is it about Friday night, as the sun is about to go down, that makes lighting candles meaningful? It's the fact that we as a unity have given it meaning. And at that time, that is a meaningful act. And it's an act which binds us all together as a community. When we blow the shofar, it can be a completely meaningless act. You're just making a sound from a ram's horn. But what is it about? We all come together on a specific day, once a year, that gives it meaning. It's not necessarily what each of us individually think or believe. It's that we all come together and we do this act in this way at this time, and that is what gives it its meaning. So rather than necessitating a shared set of beliefs or convictions, rituals are really performative entities in which in eternal thoughts and internal devotions of the people don't actually matter all that much. Blowing the shofar in shul is going to have meaning because we're all there doing it together. So long as you do the act correctly, a ritual is valid and it carries the collective meaning that the community gives it. And that really does make ritual its own category, unlike other areas of halakhah. Whereas if I, drive into your car, it will matter very much if I meant to do it on a purpose or not. Was I drunk when I did it? What was my car broken? Did I purposely do it? That will matter whether I have to pay you back, and it will matter when I do a sin, because that reflects on me as a person, and basically whether I'm wicked or not. When it comes to mitzvot, on the other hand, Rava seems to be introducing this idea that it is very much about a given community's ideas of what's meaningful, and that really brings people together. Now this, was certainly a critique of Judaism for a long time. Early Christians would critique Jews as being kind of overly obsessed with acts. That's just meaningless. You nitpick. There's no heart, and it's just about the acts. But I think what Rava's principle here shows is, yes, acts are meaningful. And the fact that we have been doing these same acts for, over 1,000 years, and the fact that I can go to any shul in the world and we, more or less pretty much do the same thing, there is something very meaningful about that. That doesn't have to be tied to, did I meant to do this, for the purpose of this or that. So I think, rather than saying something strange or counterintuitive, I think Rav is making a very meaningful point about the significance of ritual mitzvot. And this seems to be the view of the Gemara as well in following Rava. But yet, despite this clear preference that the Babli has for Rava's opinion, when we turn to the medieval rabbis who interpret the Talmud and continue to decide halakhah, we see a shift kind of back to the view of the Mishnah. And we find that while it may look like the Babli settled the issue, when we go to the medieval rishonim and the aharonim, we find that the issue is actually far from settled. And I'll just, scan. I know I brought kind of overwhelming looking sources, but I'll just read a few. So we have in source number 8, the Rif, Rav Yitzchak El Hasi, of the Sepharad milieu, he makes no mention of Rava's rule at all. All he writes is, I think this is the next, let's make sure. Yeah, this is source number 8. All he writes is, Nitkaven shomea, bo nitkaven mashmiya, bo nitkaven mashmiya, bo nitkaven shomea, lo yatsa. If the person who hears a shofar has kavanah, but the person who blows a shofar does not have kavanah, or the person who blows a shofar has kavanah, the person who hears does not have a kavanah, lo yatsa, you do not fulfill your obligation. And then the Rif jumps to the end of the sugya. Amar le Rabbi Zera l'shamai hitkaven v'tzakali. Rabbi Zera said to his servant, have intent and blow the shofar for me. So we see that you need a kavanah. And the Rif just completely leaves out Rava and this whole crazy idea that mitzvot do not require a kavanah. And the Rif just leaves it out and goes with the other view, mitzvot do require kavanah. And that is the view of most of the rishonim. Source number 10, the Milchamot Hashem, which is authored by Nachman. It is Ram Aban. And he shows how, yeah, really mitzvot do require a kavanah. And when Rava said this, meaning Rava never meant this was his own opinion. He was just saying what the father of the Shmuel would hold. But says the Ramban, this is not what Rava thinks. When Rava said this would imply one of the shofar to make music is fulfill his obligation, that's not Rava's view. And what does he do with this line? Well, that's an incorrect, that's not true. Rava did hold mitzvot require a kavanah. So therefore, says Ramban, it's not weird that the Rif left it out, because it was never actually a matter of debate. And this whole discussion here is like theoretical or whatever, but we do require a kavanah. The Baal Me'or, in source number 9, Rev Zerachya Halevi, he is one of the few to go with the view of Rava. And he generally, from what I have seen of him, he generally takes a shot, a more plain sense meaning of hagiot very often, and he writes, Lefum sugya dishamata, according to the sugya that we saw, mitzchavara hirava, it's a clearly like Rava. Damar, let's say, lo bayit a kavanah. For Rava holds, mitzvot do not require an attention, and says the Baal Me'or, it's a clear that is the way the Gemara holds as well. And he says, and this and other opinions are not like Rava, but we hold like Rava. So he's kind of the one lone view which goes like Rava. When we see how the halakhah was codified in source number 8 by the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Akairo, the halakhah is codified as follows: Hamitzasek b'tkiyat shofar lehitzlamed lo yitzei yedei chobato. If you're blowing the shofar to teach someone how to blow, or to learn how to blow, meaning you're doing it to practice and not to do the mitzvah, lo yitzei yedei chobato. You have not fulfilled your obligation. And if you hear from a person who's just blowing to learn, you also don't fulfill your obligation. And likewise, if you blow the shofar to make music, meaning explicitly, not like Rava, and if you're blowing to make music and you don't intend to do the mitzvah, lo yatsa, you do not fulfill your mitzvah. And
Dr. Schick, someone who didn't quite hear what you said, they're asking, who is this that you're speaking of that does rule according to Rava?
So the one, it's source number 9. It says Ha Me'or Ha Katan. That is a commentary on the Rif by Rev Zerachya Halevi, early medieval commentary on the Rif. And then source number 10, the Milchamot Hashem, that's Nachmanides, a commentary against the Baal Me'or, defending the Rif from Zerachya Halevi's attacks. I mean, anyone who knows a little bit about biblical exegesis knows that the Ramban does something a little similar in his biblical commentary, where he defends Rashi against Ibn Hezra. So Ramban, kind of betting the old guard against the more shocked readings.
Yeah.
So anyways, source number 9, the Me'or HaKatan by Rev Azarachia Halevi, that says, look, if you look through the sugya, it's clear that it goes like Rava. Rabbi Zera doesn't agree with Rava, but it's clear that the sugya follows Rava. It's very clear. But the Melchamot in number 10, that's by Nachmanides, the Ramban, disagrees with the Baal Me'or, and the Shulchan Aruch number 8 in codifying the halakhah goes with them majority, or goes with the Rif, goes with the Ramaban, and rules that you have to have kavanah to do your mitzvah of shofar. So if you blow the shofar to make music, or you hear the shofar from someone blowing to make music, you don't fulfill your obligation. And source number 9, the Taz, the Tishrei Zahav, explains the Shulchan Aruch's rule. Why is this? Tekayim elam keman da'amar Mitzvot Zerikhot Kavannah. Because we hold like the opinion which says mitzvot require a kavanah. So although Rava was perhaps making inroads into a new view of ritual, we see that, ultimately, I think there is a little bit of a, well, shouldn't I have to believe what I do? Shouldn't, if I do a mitzvah, I have to, want to do it for the sake of a mitzvah? It's not enough to just do it by rote, just do an act. I should know I'm doing a mitzvah. And that seems to be the position which won out. However, I do find a lot of beauty and a truth to Rava's rule, and in the role of ritual of bringing us together and really making us a coherent religious community. So we got that in an hour. I'm impressed. So everyone has questions. Anything is unclear, please.
We do have some more in the chat regarding Rava's opinion about community doing mitzvot together and the intention being expressed by them performing the mitzvot together. What about an experience like this year when many individuals are at home davening and performing mitzvot by ourselves, especially for high holidays?
Mm-hmm. That is like, as I was saying everything, that was kind of in my head, but we can't do it the way we normally do. But I think, at least I find something kind of meaningful, that even us all in our homes, there's something that binds us together, that we're all doing the same act on the same day at the same time. I mean, just like other mitzvot which we do in our home. When we light the candles, it's a very private act, but it has meaning because of when we do it. Because everyone is doing it, maybe not with me, but we're all doing it. I think there's something which kind of transcend your own personal experience to bring us kind of in a collective community, even just the feel of it. But yes, look, health comes first, so and that's a value in Chazal as well. That's another shiur, because during Bayit Sheni, the second temple time, that was not a value, and actually giving over one's life was more of a value than preserving one's life. But it's for another time. Okay.
Great. So it is now 2:00 Eastern time. So that is also a nice note to end on. Thank you, Dr. Strauch Schick, for this interesting and inspiring class. Thank you to everyone who joined us today on Zoom, on Drisha Live, and on Facebook. Our next class is tonight at 8 p.m. with the final part of a series by Sarah Zager, using sources ranging from the Talmud to Maimonides' Mishnah Torah to the Musar movement. We'll explore how our characters are formed and what tools we might have when we decided that we need to change our dispositions and tendencies for the better. Tomorrow's class will also be at 1 p.m. with Rabbi Silber, which is a close reading of Akedah Yitzchak, the purpose of this test, and its place within the book of Genesis. If you haven't yet registered for either of these classes, you can find all of the relevant information and links on our website at www.drisha.org/classes, or watch live at www.drisha.org/live. Thank you again to Dr. Strauch Schick. The chat is just giving lots of compliments for your class.
Aww, I have to look over, and then I will be looking at the screen. So
Yes, and then thank you for everyone who attended, and we hope to see everyone here soon at one of our upcoming classes at Trisha.
Thank you all so much, and I'll see you next week.
Bye, everyone.